Welcome to the first webinar of the Climate Finance ICCG webinar series. I'm Isabella Aloisio and I'm Senior Researcher at Fondazione Eni Enrico Mattei, and I will be the panelist of today's webinar. We'll focus on tools and strategies to finance the nationally determined contributions, NDCs. So this webinar will reveal who is investing in low carbon and resilient growth, where and how, and also will provide an indication of progress towards the level of investment needed to reach globally agreed temperature goals. So it will also draw on findings from the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, indicating pathways towards the implementation of countries' NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And the webinar of today is given by Dr. Barbara Buchner, who is Senior Director of Climate Policy Initiative, where she leads a global climate finance program, and she also directs work as Secretariat of the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which is a new public-private initiative that identifies cutting-edge climate finance instruments with the potential to drive investment at scale. She is the lead author on CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance Analysis, which has been cited widely and served as the basis of the 2014 IPCC Group 3 report chapter on climate finance. And over the past years, Barbara has built and directed the San Giorgio Group, which brings together key financial institutions actively engaged in green low emissions finance in collaboration with the World Bank, the OECD, and China Light and Power. And previously, Barbara served as a senior energy and environmental analyst at the International Energy Agency and as a senior researcher at Fondazione Eni Enrico Mattei. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Graz and was visiting scholar at the MIT. In 2014, Barbara was named one of the 20 most influential women in climate change. So now I leave the floor to Barbara for her 30 minutes presentation, and then that will be followed by 20 minutes Q&A. So Barbara, you can start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabella, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. It's really my pleasure and honor to provide you some of our perspectives and insights on how we can move on from the historic agreement that world leaders have reached at COP21 in Paris last December. The agreement clearly set a signal for investors and for governments and businesses to accelerate their efforts to decarbonize their economies, their supply chains, and also all of their kind of business models. So now it really is time to keep the momentum and therefore to move from the diplomacy, from the real historic agreement reached in Paris to actual implementation. And this obviously involves translating the national plans, the NDCs, as Isabella said already, into investment plans and identifying ways to align public and private money most effectively to finance the transition towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. So against this background, understanding where the world stands in relation to its low-carbon and climate-resilient investment goals is more important than ever. And therefore, as Isabella already anticipated, I'll be focusing the webinar on who really is investing, where and how, and we'll try to provide an indication of progress towards the level of investments needed against basically the 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees goal reinforced in the Paris Agreement. And we'll also, as Isabella also said, we'll also be drawing on some of our experiences and concrete examples provided through instruments that we helped develop within the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. So with this, let me just, before starting, spend a few words on Climate Policy Initiative. We are a small but very dynamic organization, and we are working on 3 main research areas. One is forestry and land use, one is energy transition, and the third is climate finance, which is the work stream that I'm leading. And our work in these areas aims to inform active policy discussions by really providing high-quality analysis of what works and what doesn't. So under the climate finance work stream, which I lead, our work focuses on 3 areas and aims to provide evidence-based analysis on climate finance to support policymakers and decision makers more generally on how to align policy with the needs and requirements of public and private investors. And we do this by providing the much needed information on climate finance flows through tracking and mapping of international climate finance. We do this by applying in-depth analysis to guide decision makers on their efforts through in-depth case studies that really looking at the effectiveness of public interventions in catalyzing private investments. And we do this by supporting innovation in finance to address investors' needs and lower costs, and by supporting the identification and design of the next generation of cutting-edge climate finance instruments. And I'll be drawing on the work across these work streams in order to, in this webinar, in order to provide you a good basis for discussions afterwards. And so with this, let me directly start into kind of our quite famous spaghetti graph, which is presented on this slide here. This diagram presents a snapshot of the most recent estimates on global annual climate finance flows and presents the flows alongside their life cycles, so from the sources on the left side through the intermediaries, the instruments, and the recipient and final users at the right side. So you can see that public sources of finance are in green on the left, flowing to intermediaries in purple, and private finance sources and their intermediaries are in red and then in black. Moving to the right-hand side, we break down public and private finance flows into instruments used to deliver the finance, primary recipients, and finally the end users of finance, which we break down into the two major categories, mitigation and adaptation. So the chart here shows rather the financial flows that we capture. So we are looking at financial commitments and are not yet able to really kind of capture all of these disbursements and secondary transactions which are not here. So this is really kind of focused on the primary financial transactions. But what we really want to do with this graph and with this work here is to identify what is going on at the moment. Where do we stand compared to where we need to stand in order to reach the goals that governments have agreed to in the Paris Agreement. So if I just want to give you kind of the overall, the high-level insights from this work here, is that total climate finance increased by 18% in 2014. So we estimate that annual global climate finance flows reached at least 391 billion on average in 2014, and that after leveling off in 2012 and declining actually in 2013, this amount of money represented a significant increase from 2013. So it's for the first time, it's really more than ever we see that money has been going into climate relevant activities. We do know that looking at the details, we do know that both total public and private finance has increased. So if you look at what stands behind this overall number, it is basically a steady increase in public finance and a record private investment in renewable energy technologies. So public climate finance reached at least 148 billion in 2014, which is about an 8% increase from 2013 and even 10% from 2012. And in this context, it is very important actors are development finance institutions who raised, managed and distributed the majority of public resources, contributing about more than 130 billion US dollars in 2014, which is about 33% of the total climate finance flows. And this is the highest one-year total since we began the mapping of flows of global climate finance in 2011. On the other hand, as I said, the private finance were really at record levels in 2014. Private finance reached 243 billion and growing by 6% in 2014, so which is by nearly 50 billion US dollars. And they remain the largest, the dominant source behind overall climate finance. But again, it is the public part of it, of the overall picture, is obviously the engine behind the overall climate investments that we could detect. Let me just go a little bit more into the role of the private sector, and I think this is particularly important when we then think about how to translate NDCs into concrete projects and deals on the ground. So what we can see is that the remarkable increase in private finance observed in 2014 was mostly driven by a record volume of new renewable energy installed capacity, which is more than 100 gigawatts, of which 95% were new solar PV and onshore wind systems, and corresponding to about 134 and 66 billion respectively invested. Just as a note, a significant portion of this increase reflects a $22 billion growth in new renewable energy investment in China, where 34% of all private finance was invested in 2014 and was driven by supportive government policies, incentives, and ambitious targets. And again, this does already provide some indications what is needed in order really to scale up and mobilize more finance in country in order to go towards the national goals. The energy investments are achieving record levels of deployment at lower cost than ever, and I think this is really good news, which needs to be stressed, and you can see that on the right-hand side of the graph here. So some renewable energy technologies are increasingly becoming cost competitive with fossil fuels. So the levelized cost of electricity for utility scale PV, for instance, has almost halved in the past 5 years, while the levelized cost of electricity on onshore wind has fallen by about 8 to 15% since 2009. And again, this really is good news, which we need to continue to spread, because it really shows that investing into climate actually can be at least as profitable as going into other technologies, and obviously incorporating all the climate co-benefits even more beneficial. Let me just go directly to where the money is ending up, and again, this gives you an indication of also where the needs are, where we at the moment have not yet enough investment flowing, and again, how we can actually think about mobilizing new actors in order to start filling the gaps and really moving countries toward implementation on the ground. You can see on this slide that mitigation continues to be the dominant source and destination of climate finance. Mitigation accounted for about 93% of total climate finance in 2014, or $361 billion in quantitative terms, and of which 81% actually went towards renewable energy. However, I do want to stress also that the heavy bias toward renewable energy reflects also the lack of data for private investments beyond the renewable energy sector. So we do know that more money is flowing also into other areas based on some sporadic anecdotal evidence, but there is no comprehensive data that can allow us to really give a full picture of the investment destinations. The public investment in mitigation focused on 3 main sectors, which was renewables, about 33% of the total public investments, energy efficiency, about 18%, and sustainable transport, about 14%. And the projects in these sectors benefited most from the low-cost loans and grants that we captured in our database. Adaptation, on the other hand, as you can see at this slide, in 2014 reached $25 billion out of the $391, or 17% of all public climate finance. Again, obviously, this does show that there is an issue. Again, it's related to data availability, but certainly it does indicate that there is a need to further scale up investments and money flowing towards adaptation categories in order to fill some of the gaps and address the needs that particular developing countries have in this context. A very important factor is also like where is the money ending up. So we did look in very much detail at the end destinations of the money in terms of geographies. If you look at mitigation finance, you can see that East Asia and the Pacific represented the main destination of mitigation finance flows. It actually represented the main destination of overall climate finance flows, accounting for about 31% of the total, or $107 billion, where overall climate finance increased actually by 22% from 2013. And as I already mentioned before, China alone accounted for 22% of global climate finance in 2014. In addition, Western Europe was the second main destination of mitigation investment, with 25% of the total, or about $92 billion US dollars, and that is despite the challenges faced by renewables in some countries due to policy changes or uncertainties. If we look at where adaptation finance adds up, you can see that the bulk of adaptation investments targeted particularly vulnerable countries in East Asia and in the Pacific region, Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And that obviously is a positive news, because it is actually saying that the money that currently is flowing, that we can track based on the data that is available, is certainly going to the most vulnerable geography, which is at least kind of going in the right direction there. I do want to stress, just in the context of adaptation, that we have again a serious data issue and also some more methodological issues, because we do have a relatively partial and uncertain estimates, as the tracking of adaptation finance is also affected by different accounting approaches used for tracking adaptation or resilience. And we have, as I already said, tracking gaps for private investment, but also for domestic budgets, which again, you do know are very important in the context of adaptation investments. And so I do want still to flag actually two developments in the context of adaptation, because notwithstanding the fact that we need to do more in the area, we have seen that there is a number of private sector-oriented adaptation projects in the portfolio of development finance institutions, and the number has actually increased over time, and progress has been made in designing approaches to drive private investment in climate resilience. And I think the second good news that we have been able to identify is that the adoption of the common principles for climate change adaptation finance tracking from a number of development finance institutions, as well as some fine-tuning of the OECD's real markers, really show that there is significant progress towards harmonization in these areas. So we do see that the field is going into the right direction. Before going into some of the concrete examples from the lab, let me just close our kind of insights from our global landscape of climate finance with a major finding that we have detected over the last years, which is that overall the majority of climate finance was raised and spent in the same country. As you can see on the slide here, it's about 74% of the finance, of total finance, was raised and spent in the same country. And if you look at private finance, it's even up to 92%, which was raised and spent in the same country, so we're spaced domestically. And this confirms the strong overall domestic preference of investors, which we have also identified in previous years, and which highlights really the importance of domestic frameworks for attracting investment. And I think again, this is an important signal for what strategy to adopt to finance NDCs, because we really got to make sure that the national policies are right, that the regulatory frameworks are right, in order to attract the investors that can help move the plans from diplomacy towards real deals on the ground. So where are we now? Based on the findings that we have, obviously, more money than ever has been invested in 2014 in climate action. But at the same time, we also know that the investments are still falling far short of what is needed if we want to avoid an increase of global temperature above 2 degrees. So if you just look at a few estimates, you've seen that, for example, the International Energy Agency estimates that $16.5 trillion must be invested over the next 15 years in energy efficiency and low carbon technologies only to fully implement the climate pledges that were made prior to Paris. So this is not yet even including all the NDCs that have been made at the end of COP21, but was made before. But it just gives you an understanding that if we really want to move there, if we really want to avoid a temperature increase of above 2 degrees, then more money needs to flow into climate action, and we really need to make sure that we can direct the money better, and that we can mobilize more investors and tap some of the capital pools that currently are still at the margins of climate change. So with this let me just move towards the work we're doing in the context of the Global Innovation Lab, because again, in order to really try to understand how we can address climate change and to move from diplomacy in Paris to implementation of the national goals, access to finance has emerged as a critical element, particularly in developing countries, which are often unable to attract private investment to low carbon and climate resilient activities. So there are specific financial barriers that must be addressed to unlock climate mitigation and adaptation efforts at the scale that is required to fill the investment gap that I've just shown you in the previous slide. So the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance is a global public-private initiative that aims to drive billions of dollars of private investment into climate change mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. The lab supports the identification and piloting of cutting-edge climate finance instruments that can drive this investment and unlock new opportunities for action. So there is momentum building around the support of new innovative ideas that come out of the lab process, and I just want to flag that because in last June 2015, the lab and its ideas were endorsed by the G7 at the summit in Germany. And for the instruments that we have developed in the first lab cycle, we've actually managed to help raise more than $500 million of new financing and move them towards piloting on the ground. So let me just give you a little bit more background on how the lab is working, and then show you really some of the concrete examples coming out of the lab and how they can be actually helping countries to think about the implementation of their national plans in the domestic context. So the lab is guided by 22 principals and their advisors, who are senior high-level experts in climate finance. Members include, as you can see on this slide, representatives from governments, from investment banks, from project development, from development finance institutions across the world. So we have been trying very hard to make sure that we are really getting a good representation that can help us identify the needs both of investors, public investors and private investors, and both host and donor governments. The lab has been developed by the UK, the US and Germany in partnership with several other climate finance donor countries such as Denmark, France, Japan, the Netherlands and Norway, and with key public and private sector leaders. It's been funded by several governments, including the UK, US, Germany and the Netherlands. It also receives important funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies and Rockefeller Foundation. And CPI, we are lucky to act as the secretariat for the lab, and we also provide the analytical support that is needed in order to develop the instruments of the lab. So just let me give you a little bit more background on how these instruments are actually chosen, and how, again, that can be helpful for countries to think about their strategies in the context of NDCs. There's a set of overall lab criteria that are meant to ensure that the overall goals of really mobilizing private investment in emerging economies at scale are met. And these criteria are mentioned here on this slide. And the lab advisors and principals actually vote on the preferred ideas that we are gathering through a crowdsourcing process. And they're voting on that based on their expert view regarding these criteria. And the first criteria is actionable, which means that ideas must have the potential to put into action within a few years without facing major constraints. And this really is trying to identify ideas that can help us move from the plans towards the real deals in a very short time. The second criteria obviously is innovative, which means that it addresses risks, costs, or liquidity gaps in new or in improved way, also learning from tools that are being applied in other contexts or for other technologies or other sectors, not yet the climate change area. Well, the catalytic and transformation relate to the ability to mobilize private capital at scale and in a way that can be replicated and sustained over a long term. And that, again, is important because obviously what we want to do is to come up with ways of mobilizing climate investments at scale and coming up with ideas that can be easily replicated across the world and really adjusted easily to different contexts, both technologies but also geographic contexts. So these criteria are also helpful to really allow countries to choose effective tools to implement their plans and also to guide their overall strategies in moving towards the implementation of NDCs. Let me just give you a little bit of background on where we are with the first round of labs instruments. And again, this is also just giving you an understanding of what types of instruments are being developed and how they can be actually helpful for countries in their specific context, depending on the priorities that countries have themselves. So these four ideas were endorsed last year by the lab. And here you can see a little bit who's behind it and what's the progress to date. And the first one on the upper left side is the Agricultural Supply Chain Adaptation Facilities, which is a value chain finance platform where multilateral development banks partner with agribusiness corporations to pass through finance to those corporation suppliers, along with technical capacity on improving climate resilience and adaptation to climate impacts. And again, this is in the context of adaptation, and as I've shown before, this certainly is a need to come up with innovative finance instruments in this area. And for this purpose, also the second lab cycle is actually having a specific focus area on adaptation finance. The second instrument that you can see on the upper right-hand side is the Climate Investor 1, which is a new entity managed by FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, and Phoenix InfraWorks. It's a private sector fund manager that combines 3 separate funds for different phases of the project cycle: in the development phase, in the construction phase, and in the operation phase. In this way, it is trying actually to really address various issues and across the overall phase of a project, from its early concept phase towards the refinancing phase, and in this way also to address some of the transaction costs and lower them. On the lower left-hand side, we have the third instrument, which is the Energy Savings Insurance, which is an insurance product that covers the expected financial value of energy savings in an investment provided by local insurance companies to energy service providers or equipment providers. And in addition, the product is paired with a package of financial measures, including credit lines from, at least initially, development banks and grant support. And we do have a first pilot in this context. It's currently underway in Mexico by the Inter-American Development Bank, with a view to replicate it on a regional scale in Latin America. The fourth instrument came out of the lab in its first cycle is the long-term foreign exchange risk management instrument, which is implemented by IFC and DCX, the currency exchange fund. And DCX actually aims to expand the availability of long-term fixed rate or inflation-linked climate financing to 8 or 10 years, and if needed even longer. But IFC would complement this by providing local currency loans and cross-currency swaps using donor funds to partly cover first loss. And again, this just shows you that lab members have really tried to identify some of the main barriers that currently impede a private investment of flowing towards climate, and then think about specific, which of the submitted ideas that we get from a wide range of actors actually address these barriers in an innovative way and in a way that allows them to move relatively quickly. And so I think we are very pleased with the progress of these ideas. And again, let me just stress again that in a little over 1 year from the start of the launch of the lab, actually managed to help fundraise more than $500 million here to really make sure that we work with host countries in order to really start the piloting of specific ideas on the ground. Let me just give you now a quick overview of the second cycle lab ideas. And you can see them here. They are actually in the overall 2 categories: mitigation, adaptation. As I said, it is we have a specific focus on adaptation finance in the second lab cycle, which was requested by lab members in light of the need to really scale up private sector adaptation finance, and this has led us to 3 instruments that are currently under development in the adaptation area. And I'm going to briefly go now through, explain a little bit more what these instruments look like and what issues they address, and then really try to show again what's the variety of instruments that we're trying to develop that then are on offer basically to countries or other managers of funds like the Green Climate Fund, for example, in order to really ensure that we move towards action on the ground. So the first instrument of the second lab cycle is addressing one of the big opportunities that we continue to hear, the energy efficiency. As I've shown before, we've also had one energy efficiency instrument in the first cycle, and this just demonstrates again that we need to have much more action in this area. And this instrument is mobilizing equity for energy efficiency investments. It's proposed by the Multilateral Investment Fund, IDB, and it really aims to mobilize private capital at scale for energy efficiency in emerging economies via a new tiered equity fund and in parallel equity guarantee facility. So it will really try to establish a donor-backed sub-regional equity fund, which is specific investment mandate to source and support energy efficiency initiatives in a number of sectors, including buildings and small or medium enterprise sectors. The private finance target that we're trying to address in this with this instrument is really venture capital, private equity, but also commercial banks. And the second instrument in the second lab cycle is the discounting and mezzanine facility, which is proposed by the International Finance Corporation, IFC. And this one is really trying to establish a small-scale renewable energy financing facility that would support local project developers to gain access to finance. And it would do so through these 2 types of facilities. One, the discounting facilities, which would be focusing on projects that have already been built, but in a way free up equity in order to catalyze new projects by actually collateralizing project cash flows. And the second facility instead is the mezzanine, a facility which would work with local banks to provide loans to eligible new small-scale renewable energy projects. So it would combine, again, a wider range of projects, both new ones and ones that are already in existence. The private finance targeted here and is venture capital, private equity as well. The first instrument in the adaptation category of the second cycle of the lab is the OASIS platform for catastrophe and climate change risk assessment and adaptation. So this is an open access platform that aims to increase data and analytics to enable risk assessment for investments in insurance and resilience products and climate adaptation. I think I said before that certainly there is a lack of data which is the basis for investment decisions. So having this platform, and the proponent is actually OASIS LMF and the Imperial College, so this platform would really help to have an open access platform that could kind of share hazard and vulnerability data in a very open way. It would have standardized collection methodology for exposure and damage data, and it would have an open access software for loss assessment and underwriting risk that can help investors again really understand what's the implications in their specific context. And it's currently developing also a sovereign risk pool for Asia, so that the initial target region for a pilot is Asia. The private finance target is obviously insurance and reinsurance companies in this context, but also banks and institutional investors. And the second adaptation instrument in the context of the second lab cycle is the climate smart finance for smallholder farmers. Again, it reflects what we've had also in the first cycle, the importance of looking really kind of down the supply chain and really get help farmers, or like the smallholder farmers, really gain access to finance. So this tool here would provide credit providers with a set of tools for managing the issuance of loans to smallholders, and they were also incentivized climate-smart agricultural practices. So they really would allow farmers to access higher levels of credit at lower rates of interest in the longer term. And this instrument is being proposed by F3 Life, and it's currently actually being piloted as a demonstration project. So again, this is something we try to help develop in order to really target crowdfunding, retail investors, and try to see how that tool really kind of helps to scale up the access to finance for smallholder farmers and replicate it around the world. And now the last instrument in the second life cycle that I'd like to briefly provide an overview of is the water financing facility, which is being proposed by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this facility would help create bankable projects to attract domestic private investors and build climate-resilient water infrastructure in regions that are at risk. So that geographies that are targeted particularly in this context is both Africa and Asia. And the key feature of this facility is that the really overall goal to mobilize large-scale domestic private finance resources for the water sectors in countries that have water stress that is due to climate change, and blending this finance with public funding. And I think, again, it does highlight one of the key goals of the lab, and that is really to try to use local and private and financial resources in the most effective way, blend that public sources, both domestic ones and international ones, in order to really create a transformation in the country and allow countries to make progress from their national priorities, from their national plans, toward the implementation of concrete deals and projects that can really help to address the priorities of the countries. And so with this, let me just briefly come to some overarching conclusions based on the work that we're doing, again, at CPI across our different work streams, and really thinking about how we can bring together all the expertise that we have in this context and help keep the momentum after Paris, and really move from the diplomacy that we've seen and the high achievements that we've seen in Paris towards real action on the ground in countries and helping countries to really meet their own priorities and really finance their national determined contributions. So I'd like to leave you with 4 overall points here, and I think the first one that we see in our work, and which is essential to make sure that we can really achieve the level of change and the investment needed in order to move us well below the 2 degrees, is that it needs all to be centered around the countries themselves. So you need to work with the countries to understand their priorities and their plans, and assess the overall landscape of actors within a country in order to really see what is feasible and how you can, what are the issues, what are the barriers to investment at the moment, and how can you really move towards the right kind of constellations of actors and tools that can then help to have concrete investments on the ground in a shorter period. The second is, and I've mentioned that several times throughout the webinar, is drawing on the finding that about 74% of overall investments are raised and spent in the same country. It is fundamental to get the domestic investment policy and the support frameworks right, and also understand the technical feasibility of the country. So again, understanding which types of regulatory reforms are needed, or which types of what is the context for the specific country, are the priorities that are expressed in the NDCs in light of the technical feasibility and the background of the country, is a core feature of really making sure that countries have the right strategies to finance their NDCs. The third is obviously using the knowledge all this knowledge here, and making sure that you're really translating the NDCs into concrete investment plans. And in this context, make sure that you innovate or to develop or also refine some of the financial instruments that meet investors' needs, and therefore mobilizing both national resources but also using international resources strategically. And this is a little bit coming back with experience that we've gained in the context of the lab. So really thinking about how you can come up with catalytic, transformative, scalable, replicable instruments that address the needs of investors in the specific country and the specific context. And the last one is very simple, really try to keep the momentum by moving from plans to action very quickly. So the importance is really not waiting till 2020. If you don't manage to start to move towards the implementation of the NDCs within the next few years in a very short time frame, then it will be impossible to get us well below 2 degrees target. And therefore, we really need to make sure that we come up and support countries in helping them to move from plans to deals very quickly. And I think with this, I'm going to stop for a second, pause for a second, and look forward to your questions and also interactions afterwards. Just leaving you here with a few websites, web pages of our websites where you can find more material that was the basis also for the webinar here. And please feel free also to get in touch with us if you're interested in some of these areas here. Back to you, Isabella.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this insightful presentation, very detailed, and describing all your instruments, the last one, and also the 5 new ones. So I will start with one question I prepared for you. So, what was the significance of the Paris Agreement on the climate finance agenda? Do you think it implied any paradigm shift?
Oh yeah, that was an excellent, excellent point, Isabella. I do think, as I said at the beginning, that this was really a historic agreement. It, for the first time, brings all nations into a common cause based on their historic, current, and future responsibilities. And so I do think that it does imply a paradigm shift. It does imply a new approach, and that basically pretty dramatic departure actually from the last 20 years of climate negotiations. And I do think that the objectives that are laid out in the Paris Agreement are visionary, but at the same time they're not overambitious, as they're building on trends that are already happening in reality. So I think the agreement also would not have been possible without a wide range of actors, including businesses. And I think all this is actually showing that many actors are already on board. And while the deal itself, I think, is a big step forward, the even larger leap is that has been the recognition that all over the world that this climate action and economic growth can and actually should go hand in hand. So the Paris Agreement has recognized that the substantial gaps between the cost of clean and fossil energy, as I've shown in the webinar also, have collapsed, and that the returns increase when we produce, for example, food by using less land better. So I think the spread of the market-driven activities that are consistent with these realizations will provide the foundations on which the Paris commitments will deepen. So for me, the Paris Agreement is laying a new foundation for meaningful progress on climate action. As I said, I do feel that it is a dramatic departure from the last 20 years of ways of dealing with climate change.
Thank you, Barbara, for this overview. We received quite a few questions from our auditors, so I'd like to ask you some of them. So the first is how the money and in which extent the investments come from developed to developing countries, which is actually the mandate for governments from the Paris Agreement.
And so how much money is coming from developed and how much is coming from developing countries?
Exactly. What is the flow from developed to developing? Can you maybe give some hints on that? Thank you.
Yes, well, it is more or less, it's actually, it's relatively balanced. And I think, again, the point I want to make here is actually the really important one, is that the majority of flows are actually domestic. So both in developed and developing countries, the majority of in climate investment that is flowing is domestic. So again, as I said, it's raised and deployed in the same country. If you're the figures that I've shown are not supposed to be compared to the 100 billion goal that has been made in the Copenhagen Agreement. This, as I said also at the beginning, the flows that I'm showing here are really providing an overall overview of what a snapshot of actually what is being invested, both by public and private, and both in developed and developing countries, and really trying to understand how we're doing against the overall 2 degrees target, but it's not looking directly at the 100 billion target. But CPI has collaborated with the OECD on a report that actually has been looking at tracking progress towards the 100 billion annual commitments that have been made by developed country parties to the UNFCCC for climate interventions in developing countries. And what we've identified there is that actually in 2014, $62 billion have been invested from developed countries in developing countries. But again, I do want to stress that there are still a lot of kind of data issues and methodological issues. So it is a first indication of the progress, but we do need to improve those data issues, but also definitional and methodological issues in order to really understand the full extent of where we are. But again, just as an indication, it's 62 billion in 2014 that we have been able to detect based on the latest available data. So it does give an indication that with 5 years away from the 2020 target year, that the situation is at least moving in the right direction, and that we're seeing quite some increases in the overall investments.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Do the public investment figures presented at the beginning of the presentation also include official development assistance?
Yes, so we are, I should have probably said that, so the figures, what we do is we're looking at the best available data and drawing data and verifying data from a number of data sources, including the OECD, with whom we are also collaborating in these areas. And so we have looked at the official ODA data, and we're looking particularly at the real marked ones, so the ones that are really specifically looking marked as ODA data, this ODA investments that are going to climate action particularly. So yes, we're looking at the real marked ODA data.
Thank you. There's a question on the instruments of your lab. So are these second cycle lab ideas for financing renewable energy initiatives as opposed to energy efficiency initiatives? So do you have any renewable energy initiatives in the second in the second phase of the lab?
Well, I think we have the discounting and mezzanine facility, which is proposed by the IFC, and that one actually is targeted in renewable energy. So this facility for sure. And I think I just also want to stress, while we are obviously now focusing on developing stress testing the second cycle, we're still working very strongly also with the first cycle ideas, because I think an important part of the lab is also that you're not only developing something and then letting basically ticking the box and letting it go, but we really try to make sure that we are assessing the progress and the impact that these ideas have. But so in specifically on renewable energy in the second cycle, it is the second mitigation idea, which is the discounting and mezzanine facility.
Yes, thank you. So as for let's say all the organizations that are implicated into the post-Paris agreement. So what do you think is the role now for the Global Environmental Facility and the Green Climate Fund?
Well, I think I've shown also that we have still quite a big target ahead of us, and I do think it is really important to have a wide range of actors that can help countries, basically support countries to move towards implementation in their specific context. So I think all the different actors, the GEF, as you said, the GCF, but also the Climate Investment Fund, and other actors, all the DFIs, I think have all specific roles. I think at the moment it is really important to take stock of what's the specific niche of the different actors, what are the risks that they can take, and in this way then really make sure that we're starting to move towards a kind of a good overall constellation of who's doing what very well and should continue to do that. How can we blend the different types of finance that come out from the different actors, and how can we really make sure that we're using the available money through the different funds in the most effective way in order to really scale up the overall investment.
Thank you. We have an interesting question here. What will there be the difference between NAMA and NDC financing?
That is a very good point. It's a very good point. I think we've all heard many acronyms over the last 10 years. I think the NAMAs and all other types of action and plans that countries have been basically making for themselves are part of the overall NDCs. I think the NDCs should just really be the overall strategy of a country in order to come up with a real plan and then translate that into investment plans. But I do think that it is the NAMAs that can be part of that. In some cases, it might be the NAMAs. So I think it is really just making sure that countries have concrete and technically feasible national plans that really focus on the priority areas and that each country has. And so I think that will continue. I think the NDCs just can help to take stock again and bring all the different all the work that has been done in the country already in the past together and make sure that we're having a consistent pathway actually towards towards implementation of the action that's needed in order to avoid dangerous climate change.
Thank you for this concrete answer. I have a question myself on so the implementation of the NDCs. So do you believe that the NDCs in developing countries can be considered as plans for access to energy?
Well, certainly access to energy is a critical point, and I think again what I also said before a little bit, it is important, I think, that to recognize that economic growth is still a key factor, particularly in developing countries, but that climate action and economic growth can and should go hand in hand. So again, just looking at the lab, we have had a number of instruments in the first round that were specifically looking at energy access and renewable energy, for example. So I think, again, energy access, access is an important point and needs to be integrated in the context of the NDCs. So you really got to make sure that you're developing national strategies that can help countries continue to grow while addressing climate change and do that in a way that is really beneficial for the people and in the country. So yes, I think it's a good point that you raise, and I think energy access certainly needs to be better integrated in all these national plans.
Thank you. And can you explain how this gap, let's say time gap, between the fact that NDCs are conditional upon receiving financial support under a global climate agreement will come into force in 2020. So what is the time frame of this financing needs that you say, and in investments in developing countries? I mean, they need support, but they should wait for a while. So how do you see this process?
I don't think that I think we don't have the time actually to wait anymore. I think we really need to move as quickly as possible towards the implementation of NDCs. I mean, the fact is that we still are in the 100 billion period now, so there is commitment from developed countries to continue to achieve their goal to help developing countries scale up investments. And so I think this one has also been reinforced again in the Paris Agreement that will also continue after 2020. So it is something, I think, where we need to make sure that we're laying the foundations now and that we don't lose too much time by waiting for for other kind of milestones and for other agreements to happen. I think we really need to move quickly, and I do think that countries through their agreements have actually made clear and recognized the need to kind of scale up investment. And this, I think, is also reflected in the fact that in the Global Innovation Lab we have 8 donor countries who are really committed to find ways to move towards action very quickly. So I think this is just showing that there is a general recognition that it's time to move from talk to action.
Great, thank you. Yes, this answer partly answered also to another question, which also has let's say another point that maybe can give some more hints to the discussion, which is what are the main challenges when it comes to financing the NDCs? Financial challenges or technical or.
I think, it is a big goal. I think many of the NDCs are very comprehensive. It's big plans. I think, as I said in my last slide, I think it's the real challenge is to make sure that you get a good understanding of the priorities and the background and the circumstances of a specific country. Work with the country to really identify ways of addressing the key priorities and the types of investors needed, but I think really make sure that this is country driven, that it's really something that can enable a transformative change in the country, because what really needs to happen is that there is the right environment is built for local investors, for local actors, and that we really can make sure that it's not only kind of a one-off financing of deals from the international sources, but that it's really instead building the right in-country capacity that then can enable us to continue and sustainably implement climate action in countries. So you will need to look at both legal issues, economic issues, financial issues, and concrete required technical issues that really, when you think about how you're preparing the pathways towards the implementation of NDCs. So it is a complex problem, but I do think that around the world people have developed the right skills and there is the right institutions out there to do that. But I do think it needs a holistic view, really acknowledging the different skill sets that are needed in order to address this overall kind of challenge of implementing the NDCs.
Thank you very much. There's let's say last before the final questions about carbon markets. So would they be replaced by a new mechanism under COP21? And are CDMs still to be considered as a source of financing?
Well, I think this is a question that many people are asking themselves after having looked at the Paris Agreement. I mean, Article 6 clearly does open the door for sustainable development mechanism. I think there is actually the need to really, again, take stock of what has happened in the past and do that very much with the specific country circumstances in mind. I think it will be something that we also will need more research on, so I hope that FEAM will continue to be also kind of a very important driver in this context. But I think I don't really have an affirmative, unfortunately not yet an answer to this one, but I certainly think that the Paris Agreement has kept the door open, let's say, for market mechanisms and for having them increase again in prominence.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So we have a few auditors who thanks you for your great presentation and ask some detailed question on lab instruments. I think that possibly they can maybe go online on your website and see them in more details.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and in general, yes, there's a question on the time frame, which is maybe it's good to answer. So what is the time frame for the achievement of these instruments? Do you have any time frame?
The time frame on which instruments now? On the lab instruments?
Yes, on the lab instruments. Yes.
Yes. So again, I think everyone who's interested, please have a look at our website. We do have lots of information there. We also obviously have our contact information. Be happy to get in touch if you're interested in specific ones. I think the time frame, again, as reflected by one of the lab criteria, the actionable one, we certainly try to move instruments as quickly as possible towards their piloting. We have, out of the first 4 that we have developed in the first lab cycle, which basically ended in last autumn, the first lab cycle. We have 2 of them already kind of in piloting stage, and we obviously then hope that they will be replicated and scaled up in other contexts. But I think we don't have a generic time frame, but we certainly try to use the annual cycles that we have in the lab as indication of how quickly you can move from a concept towards a pilot. And I think if you manage within the first 2 years of the lab to really get them to piloting stage, I think this for us is a success, as we are really, working also with donors and host countries to help the implementing entities of the different instruments and get really concrete pilots that can test the instrument then on the ground. But I think the sooner the better. But I think in general we are trying to move within 1 to 2 years time from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara, for this interesting presentation. And we had many auditors today. So thank you for to all of them. And so if you want to see more on the lab instruments, you can go on CPI website, and today's presentation will be uploaded on ICCG website, so you can find all the information that you want. So thank you very much again, Barbara, and see you to the next webinar of the ICCG Climate Finance series. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Isabella, and thanks for hosting me.
Bye to everybody. Bye.